My mother and I moved into my great-grandmother's house when she and my father got a divorce. It wasn't the best neighborhood, but we felt safe because at the same time, we had very good neighbors and family that lived down the road. My mom had a friend from work that she liked to hang out with named Polly, who was married to Mason, and they had a son a few years older than me. They moved into a rent house into our neighborhood, and I spent a lot of time playing video games and riding bikes with their son. Mason helped my mom with a lot of things around the house. He helped her install a ceiling fan into our living room, and when we were robbed, would call the house and make sure everything was okay. He was generally a nice guy, but even as a kid, I couldn't help but be a little uncomfortable around him. I think he worked at one point in time, but as far as my memory goes, I can't remember him having a steady job. Years go by, and I believe he became an alcoholic and addicted to drugs. It got so bad that P divorced him and moved out of the house, taking her son with her. Now that Mason was a single man, he decided to set his sights on my mom, and that's when all the trouble began. Now, my mother is a strong woman. She immediately told him that just because he was single, that she could only see him as a friend because he had been married to Polly for so long. My mom had never gave him an inkling that she was interested in him this way. Unfortunately, Mason had been someone that my mom trusted, so not only did he have our home phone number, but he had my mom's work phone number as well. He would call her constantly at work just to see what she was up to. Then, when my mom stopped picking up the phone when he called, he would jump our fence and wait under our carport until she got home from work. There were times where he would even sit behind our house, so my mom would pull into the carport and he would come around the house and pretty much trap us into giving him a ride somewhere. At this point, I was a teenager, probably around 16 or 17, and he would say things to me like, "You're getting so pretty," and look me up and down with this creepy stare. That was when my mom became worried for my safety as well. Before I go further, I must admit that my mom had a slight hoarding problem. It wasn't anything like the TV show Hoarders, but it was just mess that accumulated over time that overwhelmed us both. I contributed to the problem, so the blame can't all be on her. Because of this, we didn't let anyone into our house, and I never had friends over because it was so messy. My mom was embarrassed about the mess, but at the same time felt overwhelmed about trying to do anything about it. There were points in our lives where our house was kept clean, but they were very short-lived. The only reason I mention this is because it has a role to play in this story. One day, we came home from someplace and followed our normal routine. I watched TV or played video games before going to bed. Even though I was older, I slept in the same bed as my mom because I had always had a bad problem with dealing with the dark. I fell asleep as my mom did her crossword puzzle beside me. I was awoken out of a deep sleep with adrenaline coursing through my veins when I heard my mom yell, "What the fuck are you doing in my house?" My mom never used the F-bomb, so that terrified me. I was frozen. That's when I heard Mason's voice. He had gotten high and broken into our house to steal some food. When he heard us coming home, he did the only logical thing by hiding in my mom's closet for 5 hours. My mom yelled at him until he got the fuck out of our house. But after that, we were both so shaken. I can't remember if we went somewhere else for the night or if we stayed there, But it only got worse after that. My mom threatened him with a restraining order, and the next day, there was a crudely written letter in our mailbox with the words, "A picture is worth 1,000 words," where he threatened to call the health department on her. My mom and I spent the rest of the day cleaning and crying, wondering why this was happening to us. I have never felt so scared in my life. One of my reoccurring childhood fears was something coming out of the closet to get me. She left to talk with him and told him that we would forget this if he'd just leave us alone. And he did for a while. Then he started calling my mom's work and leaving disturbing messages. He was so messed up in the head that he actually thought he and my mom were in a relationship and were having sex. They weren't, and couldn't understand why she was ignoring him. One night, I was on the phone with my friend when I heard my mom pull up into the carport. I was going to the door to unlock it to let her in when I heard my mom scream. I didn't think anything of it because we had frogs and bugs that would scutter about and catch you off guard. Then I heard a man's voice. I knew it was Mason. That was when I was really scared, knowing I was on the other side of that door and something was happening to my mom and I didn't know what to do. I was too afraid to call the cops, and since we lived in a bad neighborhood, the response time would have been too long for them to actually do something. My mom came into the house safe and was on the phone with her boyfriend, who's 6'3" and built like a tank, who was on his way. I gathered some clothes while my mom and I tried to keep it together. She told me that while she was getting her stuff together, Mason had come from behind the house, wearing women's clothing. He had scared my mom by popping up out of nowhere, which is why she had screamed. My mom had told him he needed to get lost, but he insisted that she give him a ride. She started punching at him enough to get him away from the car door for her to lock herself inside the car. She called her boyfriend and told Mason that she was on the phone with the cops. He took off running after that, and my mom stayed in the car until she thought it was safe. We lived with my mom's boyfriend for about 3 months after that, before my mom felt safe enough to go home. We got a restraining order against Mason, and all the time after that, he never bothered us. Because of this incident, I don't think my mother got another full night's sleep in the house. I'm surprised I was able to. My mom was cleaning out her closet. She wanted to be able to know that there wasn't anyone in there, and she found a cutout picture from a porn magazine of people having sex. My mom asked me if it was mine in hopes that it was. It wasn't. Just another piece to the creepy stalker pie. My mom said the first night she slept soundly was when she ran into Polly and Mason's son, who had told her that Mason passed away. My mom felt awful, but it gave her such a sense of relief that she would never worry about him again. She said she couldn't even feel bad.
I discovered this sub a few hours ago, and I've been loving it so far, so I thought it's my turn to contribute. This happened about 6.5 years ago, so I was about 11. I live in a quiet village in a nice tucked-away part of the English countryside, not too far away from any big towns to be considered remote, but it was still quite rural. It was midsummer, and I had 2 of my friends over who had never met before, so I was quite excited. They got on really well, and we had a great time playing some Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Cell Damage Overdrive on PS2. Legendary games, by the way. We've been playing for a while, so we decided to go outside, probably after some heavy encouragement from my parents, and appreciate the summer weather. We decided to grab some nets, buckets, and a few fishing lines so that we could go down to the village river and look for crayfish. You have to cover around a mile of footpaths, give or take a couple 100 meters, to get to this river from my house. Everything was 100% fine, and it was only about 3 in the afternoon, so far from the late times at which you'd expect creepy people to be out and about. This is where it gets strange, though. When we were done looking for crayfish and decided to head back to my house, we made my tall and exuberant friend, I'll refer to him as Tall Friend from here on, carry everything we brought in a net over his shoulder to make him look like a classic cartoony homeless person, with their belongings wrapped up and tied to the end of a stick as punishment for dropping my favorite pair of shoes in the river. At this point, we're just about to head off when we see what looks like someone dressed as if they'd just come back from a business conference right at the end of the path behind us. This path connected my village with another very small village and was about half a mile long, with the river intersecting it about a third of the way up from my village. We thought it was kind of weird at first, as you rarely get to see anyone besides dog walkers up here, but we shrugged it off pretty quickly. What really caught our attention was once we reached the end of the path to the river, the person we saw as a speck in the distance earlier had gotten closer. A lot closer. As I mentioned a few sentences ago, the river was a third of the distance into the path. In the time it took us to cover the same distance back, this person had covered more than 2/3 of it. This sincerely creeped us out, and even stumped the extremely laid-back, laugh-at-anything attitude of Tall Friend. As this person had gotten a lot closer, we were able to see their appearance in full detail. It was a blonde woman in professional-looking black business attire. She looked like she was in her late 20s, early 30s at the latest, and was even wearing small heels. That detail is what started to make me feel uneasy, as she was so out of place on these muddy country paths in heels while gaining distance on us every second. We increased our pace to stay ahead of her, down the tracks back into my village for the next few minutes as she continued to follow us, although it was technically all one path, so we thought that maybe she just hadn't had the chance to turn off to wherever she'd need to go. This was wishful thinking, as even when we took direct turns into the additional set of paths that would eventually lead back to my house, she continued to follow us. It wasn't like there was any houses she could have been wanting to get to. The most urban thing in the area was a small war memorial. We started to panic when she closed in on us, to a distance where she could have heard anything we said or where she could have shouted something to us instead, showing she clearly wasn't just lost and looking for directions. At this point, we decided to take action and planned to dart off into the woods next to us at the next corner, but before we could, my other friend pointed out that his shoes were far too loose to handle any running. Me and Tall Friend said we'd stop for him if he wasn't left behind us, but he insisted he could tighten them, so we kept walking slowly while he did that. This moment confirmed all our suspicions. As soon as he bent down to fix his shoes, the woman suddenly leaned forward and increased her pace. We called out our friend's name, telling him to run, and we just about made it round the corner and into the woods before she could catch up. To our delight, this threw her off enough that she couldn't follow us any longer. However, after emerging from the other side of the woods back into the center of my village, we saw a car headed back toward the paths we were followed on, with a man driving and what looked like our stalker in the passenger seat. Let's not meet ever again, please, creepy businesswoman.
This happened to a close friend of mine from work, who told me this last night, and it sufficiently creeped me out. So her mother is in the hospital, and she was on her way home from visiting her one night last week. She stopped at a 24-hour Tesco on her way back to get some groceries and petrol, so it was around 10 p.m. when she finally set off for home, the journey to her house taking around 40 minutes. About 5 to 10 minutes into the usual routine trip home, she noticed a car coming up close behind her, flashing its lights, as if trying to get her to pull over. It was just as she was approaching a few miles of road that were fairly deserted, save for a couple of houses, but mainly flanked by fields on the other side. It was dark, so she couldn't make out the car or the driver, but was fairly certain it wasn't a police car. Besides, she's a careful, teetotal driver with a fully functional vehicle. There should have been no reason for someone to pull her over. Also, She's not so naive that she would just stop on this lonely stretch of road for anyone without a good reason. The other driver was persistent, though, and alternately pulled really close, then backed off and flashed the lights. The car continued to follow closely and flash her. It was only as they entered a more populated area and more cars were driving around that the flashing lights and tailgating stopped. Still right behind her, though. At this point, she was significantly freaked out, but in the panic of the moment, couldn't think of what to do, and still wasn't positive she was being followed. But that was wishful thinking, she said. The small town where she lives has a huge and very busy roundabout with many lanes that must be navigated carefully as you approach. It's very easy to take the wrong exit, especially if you're unfamiliar with the area. She waited until the very last second before pulling out, just before a truck, hoping that the car stalker would get stuck behind a stream of traffic. She could easily lose the car after that, as where she lives has so many roundabouts that if you don't know where you're going, you'd be lost without a GPS system. Her heart sank, though, when she heard the honk of a truck horn behind her, and looking in the rearview mirror, realized the car stalker had took a chance, pulled out right after her, and was again right behind her. With absolutely no doubt now that she was being targeted, her mind raced, and all she could think was how she couldn't drive home or even to her daughter or sister's house, as she didn't want to lead this person right to her or to her family's door. She grew up in the town, though. She knows all the shortcuts, dead ends, roundabouts like the back of her hand. So she proceeded to lead a merry dance around the area, up a street, down a street, round a roundabout, double back, and so on. This went on for a while. Maybe an hour or more, she estimated. Earlier, she had almost skipped getting petrol, as she knew she had just enough to get home. At this moment, she was thanking her lucky stars that she had got it, or she'd be breaking down right about now. The car was still following, but at a further distance this time. She pulled suddenly, without indicating, onto a long main road where there were about 10 to 12 identical side streets running parallel to each other along a road. These led up to cul-de-sacs that pretty much all looked the same. Seeing no sign of the car behind, she swung down a random street, drove up a little behind another car, then killed the engine. Ducking down after 5 to 10 minutes of what she described felt like holding her breath, she had another check of her surroundings, and it appeared that she had lost the stalker. Full of relief, she turned around, pulled out of the side street, and there he was. She could make out the outline of a man in the driver's seat, so she knew for sure that he was male, which somehow made it so much worse. He had pulled up on the opposite side of the road and was just waiting for her. Like he knew where she'd gone and was just taunting her. Frozen for a second, she was unable to gather any more details before she got it together and sped off in the opposite direction. It took about another 30 minutes of cat and mouse, plus another 20 minutes waiting it out, before she finally lost him. She managed to quickly pull into an empty driveway after taking a few erratic turns. She was on the right side of a 4x4, which obscured her car, and she switched off all the lights before he got a chance to follow her. She waited even longer this time, though. She was sure he'd be waiting. But he must have either got bored or lost her. She was looking over her shoulder the whole way home, though. And she still does now. In hindsight, she realized the best thing to do would have been to go to the nearest police station, or at least call them. But hindsight is a wonderful thing. The next day she was telling her daughter, who was furious with her for not calling the police or telling her sooner. She did then make a report at a local police station and was disturbed at what she discovered. Firstly, her report was not the only one. 2 other women had reported almost identical experiences. One of them had called the police while being followed and asked if there was any unmarked police vehicles in the area that may be signaling for her to pull over. They indicated there were not any such vehicles and advised the woman to pull into a nearby well-lit and staffed service station where they met her to take her report. He soon took off when he saw where she was headed. The other woman had managed to lose him also, but driving towards the police station. This one was in broad daylight. There may be more women who just haven't reported it. Even more worrying, the police suspect the stalker is a rapist who has recently been released from prison. The MO of his previous crimes matched this. He would pose as a concerned fellow driver, pull a woman over with some BS about a light being out on her car or whatever, then pull her into the back of the car and rape her. They haven't been able to charge him with anything so far, as, fortunately, he has not managed to succeed in his tactics this time. So, weird and creepy car stalker guy? Let's not meet.
This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago, when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult. To come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. And I'll have to park on the street because the apartment complex had limited parking. One more thing. There's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place: a brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall and rather big, read intimidating, I felt confident that I would be alright. And I was, for a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night I was sitting on my porch, having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or something. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning, I got up for my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got onto my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out of his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call the police about George, but he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime. So there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with other women before. With that info in mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body, and you know they are there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife, and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe my mom was trying to find me a free defense class, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if I need it. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch, below the wall, out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or raped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No." "He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot, there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist height and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walking by saw George sitting on the box, masturbating. Was he waiting for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him? The thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night, he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's ass gonna get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else. Until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance. "He's bleeding!" "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad! Come quick!" I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with the real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. I didn't know we had bears in the city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all the adults, people around 30 to 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell where we kept our towels. She rushed to grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up, what happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was just one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in, and then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out, don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give my statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later and all these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 or 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I had called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's messages, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 cop cars. 14. He still kept staring at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I had never felt in my life. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back to my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lungs and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I felt like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it all, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would stay away for good. Several poor women had had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to me to tell me the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place. Buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas, on good behavior, or whatever. But my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can. But I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad is doing all right now. He's just had his 3rd surgery on Tuesday trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We are hoping that this will be his last one, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. George, let's not meet again.
I was encouraged to post this story here from Creepy Encounters. I hesitate to use the word stalked due to the infrequency of when things happened, but I really don't have another word for what's been going on for so long. I'm a 28-year-old female from South Carolina. This man, my mom's ex-boyfriend, has been an unwelcome intrusion in our lives for 30 years. And frankly, I have a feeling it's not going to end anytime soon. Short of taking drastic measures that are too extreme to even consider. My family and I don't seem to have much choice other than to put up with it. We can't ignore it, because just when you think it's over, he pops back up. Or we run into him in town, someone mentions his name, or an event will trigger a memory, and we're right back in that hopeless, frustrating feeling of powerlessness. I can't recount every single step that's brought my family to this point. It would just take too long, but I can relate the major events that have happened. Even without every detail, this is going to be pretty long. I guess I should start at the beginning. To make a very long story short, my mom met this guy in high school. His name was Rick. Rick and my mom dated for 4 years, starting at the end of their senior year. He was the son of a local politician, very good-looking and athletic. I've talked with her at length about her time with him, and she told me that while they were initially together, there wasn't anything that she saw that would indicate something was off about him. Slowly, though, over the course of the relationship, he changed. He started telling her what she could wear, who she could talk to. He told her that she couldn't smoke anymore, that she had to get a new car because he couldn't be seen with her in that old truck that she drove, that she needed to move out of her parents' house and marry him as soon as possible. He was also pushing her pretty hard about sleeping with him. She didn't, and she was never able to say, at least to me, why that was, other than a feeling that she had that she shouldn't. For the most part, my mom ignored the way he was, trying to control her life. She didn't do any of the things he wanted her to do. She's stubborn and very no-nonsense type of person, so it floors me that she put up with his crap for so long. But she didn't feel like she could do any better, and she thought that, given time, she could change him. Rick didn't change. At least, not for the better. If anything, he got worse. He became verbally abusive, and he put her down every chance he got. Eventually, she broke up with him. She had found out that he was sleeping with a friend of hers, among several other women. Over the course of the year that they were no longer together, Rick was constantly trying to get back with her. He'd call her at work, at home. He'd drive by where she was working her second job, or follow her when she drove somewhere other than to work or home. He tried to get her friends to tell him where she was or to give her messages for him. He even had his mother stop by the grocery store and plead with her to get back with him. She told my mom that even though she was from a lower-class trash, her son was devastated without my mom in his life. While all of this was happening, my mom met my dad, and when Rick found out about it, he seemed to back off a little, and comes from a rough family with a reputation for fighting. I guess that made him hesitate to keep up with his behavior, for a little while anyway. That changed when my parents got married. My mom would pick up the phone when it rang and hear heavy breathing on the other line. A man's voice that was clearly disguised would try to ask her questions about her marriage, or say something lewd about her or the intimate aspect of my parents' relationship. I say try because as soon as she heard the voice, she'd hang up, although she wasn't always quick enough. Back then, there were no stalker laws, and since there wasn't any kind of physical assault, there wasn't much the police could do about it. Not that they would have anyway. We're from a small town. Population hardly more than about 5,000, and the sheriff was real good friends with Rick's father. Suffice to say, the legal avenue was closed to my family. My grandmothers, tired of the harassment of their children, got together at one point and cornered Rick's mom in town one afternoon. They told her point blank that if she couldn't get a handle on her son and his behavior, they were going to make sure the newspapers found out what other recreational activities he had been up to, which, as you can probably guess, weren't legal. Again, the call stopped. Then I and my sister were born, and all hell broke loose. Rumors started flying around town that Rick was actually our father, and that my mom had been having an affair with him. Pictures of my mom with us at the store or somewhere in town would turn up in the mailbox, along with letters stating how much we looked like Rick. Or, even more creepy, they would say how much we looked like our mom and how very attractive we were going to be when we grew up. When my mom showed that particular letter to my dad, he was livid. That night, he drove out to the dive bar where Rick and his friends were known to hang out. Rick wasn't there, but about 3 of his buddies were. My dad demanded that they tell him where Rick was, but they wouldn't. When my dad turned to get back in his truck, intending to keep looking for him, the men ganged up on him. Like I said before, my dad's a big dude, and he grew up fighting. He handed their butts to them, broke 2 noses, and the other one lost his front teeth. He told them to let Rick know that he'd find him if anything else happened. Several years went by very quietly. We worked and we made a life as a close-knit family. But when we were around 16 and 15, things started up again. Rick had, by this point, started and failed several businesses, gotten married twice, and had children of his own. With mouths to feed, he'd taken a job as a manager at the local grocery store. I was at driving age by this point, and it wasn't uncommon for my mom to send my sister and I to the store while she worked. We always enjoyed this, because it gave us a chance to play our loud music and talk out of our mom's earshot about things she really wouldn't have wanted to hear. You know, typical teen girls. The first time we went in, and Rick was working there, he saw us, and he easily recognized us. I look more like my mom than my sister does, pretty much a carbon copy of her, whereas my sister is a spitting image of my dad. Plus, it's a small town. It wasn't hard for him to figure out who we were, and when he did, he followed us through the whole store. Every time we turned down an aisle, he'd be there, with the creepiest smile on his face. We had no idea who he was. We were practically babies when the pictures and letters had been put into our mailbox, and as children, it was a topic that our parents had rightfully not talked about in front of us. It wasn't until we were in our late teens that we were told the whole truth. Rick stopped us at the end of every aisle and would ask us questions. He asked us if we knew our mom's birthday, if we liked the same things she did, if we liked our dad. He told us how pretty we looked and how much we resembled her. We brushed most of this off. We were used to being recognized by people in town that knew our parents and grandparents. Most of the time, they just say something like, "Hey, I knew your mom," and never introduce themselves beyond that. So it didn't strike us as weird. It was the shower of compliments about our looks and our figures that made us uncomfortable. We rushed through the store as fast as we could get away from him and back home. We didn't say anything to our parents. Both of our parents are overprotective, and we didn't really want to stir up any trouble. Stupid idea, I know. Boy, do I know. Because this became a weekly ritual for almost a year. Every week, we would be sent to the store for the groceries, and Rick would be there, following us around. No one said anything, even though the cashiers would look at him funny as he stood in the checkout line with us, staring at us and talking nonstop. It got to the point that we would be in tears when we got outside again. But there wasn't a word said. Maybe the other people working in the store thought that they'd get punished or fired. Maybe they were afraid of him. I don't know. But when we finally did tell our parents, they were furious. Not so much with us, but over what had happened to us. We stopped going to that store and started shopping at the Walmart in the next town over. My granddad met with the store owner, and Rick lost his job. Again, things were quiet for a few years. Occasionally, we'd see him in town, and when we did, we avoided him as best as we could. Sometimes he'd sneak up on us and try to talk to us. Raised in the South, United States, tradition of manners, we couldn't just ignore him without feeling like we were committing a sin, so we made it as brief as possible. The compliments still came, weird and entirely unwelcomed, but neither of us knew how to handle them other than to say, "Thank you," and leave quickly. Time went on, and we went to college, pretty far off, where there wasn't a chance of running into him. But he was still a presence. When Facebook came out, he was there, trying to friend us, sending us messages to ask how our mom was doing, and how we liked our school. We both blocked him, but he somehow tracked down our email addresses. It wouldn't have been hard for him to get them. He just had to ask the right people, and we never thought about having to guard that information. Both of us got bombarded with emails from Rick, asking us the same questions again about our parents, and talking about how much he looked forward to seeing us at home. The worst one was a message he sent me, asking me to let my mom know that all she had to do was tell him she was leaving my dad, and he'd divorce his current wife, and leave his kids, and marry her, and that he could be the dad my sister and I needed in our lives. I blocked him immediately and called my sister to let her know so she could be on the lookout. My mom doesn't have an email address, so he couldn't harass her like that, but the heavy-breathing phone calls came back for a while. Then we all got cell phones, and we haven't given the number to anyone except immediate family or people we can trust not to relay them to him. Which brings me to the most recent event, and the reason I decided to sit down and write this out. I've just moved back to my hometown, fresh out of grad school and newly married. Things have been quiet for a long time. Rick was the furthest thing from my mind. My husband and I had stopped by Walmart to pick up last-minute gifts for Christmas. We decided to split up, and I was just coming out of the restroom. My brain was focused on working my phone, trying to call my husband so I can find him in this supermarket labyrinth, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. Distracted, I turned around and almost dropped my phone when I realized I was standing face to face with that man. Rick grinned at me and said hello. I'm ashamed to say I couldn't do more than stare at him. He'd snuck up on me, and I was so startled and freaked out that I couldn't say a word. Then he leaned in with that smile on his face, the one he used to wear when he'd follow my sister and me. And he goes, "You look just like your mom. If I was your dad, though, you look more like me." I was frozen as he grinned at me for what was probably only a few seconds, but it felt much, much longer. Then I turned on my heel and walked away, as calmly as I could. I put my phone to my ear and called my husband. It took everything I had not to burst into tears right there in the middle of the store. My husband knows the stories, and he was ready to beat the crap out of Rick for saying anything to me, but I ushered him out to the car. I just wanted to go home, so we did. Without buying anything that day, I told my parents, and they were angry too. They still are. It seems like no matter how much time passes, Rick's still hanging around like a boogeyman. It's not over, and I know that. It might not ever be, but it feels good to get this all out. I don't know what to make of his little declaration, but it makes me feel sick to my stomach to think too much about it, or what else other than the obvious he might have been implying. What I do know is that I'm very, very grateful that he isn't my dad, because I can't imagine what my life would have been like then.
So let me start off by saying, working in a psychiatric hospital is no picnic. I'm a registered nurse, and I love my job. You deal with individuals on their worst day of their lives. You also get to see them get better and walk out a new person. That is the best feeling in the world. Anyway, let me get to my story. I will not mention names for privacy reasons. You know, HIPAA and all that jazz. I also won't disclose for which hospital I work for. So it started off as any ordinary day until around 9 a.m. I'm standing on the day hall speaking to a patient when all of a sudden I hear one of my employees yell, "Oh shit! No, 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 no! He got off the unit and he's heading for the front doors!" As I'm running off the unit and down the main hallway, I see the patient and he is running as fast as he can to the front of the building. He literally jumps up into the air and basically drop kicks both doors open and runs outside. I'm the first person out of the building after this patient. He's sprinting down the street, and I know he's going to run out of speed soon, because face it, no one can keep up the speed that he's running at, and this man was not in the best of shape. Eventually he stops and is standing there breathing heavy and basically almost doubled over because he's so out of breath. So here I am, this 5'3", 120-pound girl, telling this 6'3", 190-pound man that he needs to cooperate with us and come back to the unit. I inform him that he is not able to just leave when he wants to, because he's court-ordered by a judge to be at the hospital. Of course, I get the lovely reply that I almost always get when I tell patients that they can't just leave, which is, "Fuck you, bitch." Little side note, this man's crime was not a little trespassing charge. It was a violent offense. So it was probably not the brightest idea for me being the only person standing there with him at the time, but hey, you gotta do what you need to do in situations like this. Anyways, by this time, I've gotten more staff and the hospital police are on their way, so I don't feel unsafe. Once he sees the police car pull up to where we were, he finally realized it's over and we will be returning to the unit. The police handcuff him and put him in the back of the car and drive him back to the building. Once we get back to the unit, the patient becomes extremely aggressive, violent, threatening, and attempting to assault staff and police. We made the decision to place him in 4-point restraints for his, ours, and the other patients on the unit's safety. As we are trying to get him into restraints, he is fighting us the entire time. All of a sudden, I see the patient spit something out from his mouth. I'm thinking in my head, what the hell was that? All of a sudden, the staff member who was helping me restrain the patient's left side holds up his hand and blood is dripping down it. That's when I come to the horrible realization that this patient just spit out part of that man's finger. I get him out of the restraint room and into the nurse's station. I administer first aid while everyone else is finishing up what they were doing. Once I get him stable and get him out on his way to the hospital, I go back into the restraint room to speak with the patient. By law, we are required to inform the patient what he needs to do in order for him to come out of 4-point restraints. I inform him that in order for him to be released from 4-point restraints, he cannot physically assault anyone. I ask him if he's able to do that, and he looks at me and says, "That was delicious." Can I have some more? It's been so long since I've had that. Needless to say, he wasn't ready to come out of restraints.
I used to work at one of those 24/7 Walmart supercenters. I was right out of high school, 19-year-old female, and worked as a cashier for 2 terrible years where I was subjected to all kinds of abuse from customers and coworkers alike. I mean, I was screamed at, slammed into a register face first, groped, and even farted on once because this old lady was mad that oranges were priced each, and not by the pound. No, I'm not kidding. However, the time that sticks out in my head the most is the time a customer tried to follow me home. I had just started my shift, and the second I got on the register, I had a line about 10 people long. For some reason, the Walmart I worked at never had enough registers open, so people were usually really mad and impatient by the time they got to me. I get right to work and keep a smile plastered on my face, while making the minimal mandatory small talk. How are you? Did you find everything? Most customers were polite, but not very interested in making small talk, so it was easy to fall into a bit of a cashier robot mode. I get to this guy who had only 2 items, yogurt and Band-Aids. I ring it all up in record time and neatly bag it up, but the customer doesn't seem to be paying any attention. He wouldn't look at me or answer my greeting. His eyes just stared right down at the conveyor belt. Maybe he was a bit zoned out. The conveyor belt didn't look too dirty. I hadn't had a chance to wash it yet because the second I walked over to the register, people lined up. Side note, always bag up your produce. Conveyor belts get really nasty. I tell the man his total, which was something like $4.36, and he starts fishing in his pockets for exact change without looking up. Inwardly, I groan but keep my customer service smile fixed into place while I wait. He is wearing one of those muddy brown denim jackets with lots of pockets, and as he rifles through, I keep catching whiffs of stale BO and cigarettes. His hands were pretty dirty too, and all dried out from the cold winter. He dumps out an assortment of change on the counter, still not looking at me, and I begin to count it up. Everything is uncomfortably quiet. I can feel the eyes of every customer waiting in line boring into me, all except the guy who was then digging in his pants pocket too. He was about 30 cents short. I let him know once I was sure he wasn't going to find any more coins. It was then that he looks at me, making a scrunched up face. His eyes were very dark brown, almost black, and they pierced right into me, accusingly, as if he thought I was lying or something. While he was watching, I counted everything again. It's only 30 cents. Can't you just give me your employee discount? No, that's against the rules, I answered apologetically. Want to put something back? I wasn't about to get fired for giving someone my discount, which was only 10% if you're wondering. He wasn't the first person to ask for it, but most people pretended they were joking. He was not joking. No, I want them, he said, glaring at me. I was beginning to wish he'd start staring at the conveyor belt again, instead of at me. He was making me pretty uncomfortable. If I'd had 30 cents in my pocket, I would have paid it up myself, just to get this guy to leave. He reaches over to take the bag, but I turn the little bag carousel so that he can't. That was probably a stupid move on my part, but it wasn't like I could let him steal, right? If my register was short 30 cents, my supervisors would be all over me. I know you get a discount. Just plug it in. He completely blows up at this point, but I just shake my head and look at the other customers, probably with a deer in headlights expression. People are watching, but no one does anything. This is just something that's inconveniencing them, even though I'm actually pretty scared. I'd already started flashing my register light so that the CSM would come, but they were notorious for taking their sweet time. I'll get a CSM, but it might take a few minutes, I nervously offer. but the man just goes off and goes on about how it's not that much and he needs it, with some explicit language thrown in, of course. He leaves before the supervisor comes over, grabbing all of his change and shoving it all into one pocket before stomping off. I'm relieved that he's gone and continue working in an uneasy silence. Everything seemed to go on as normal after that. My shift ends at midnight and I managed to clock out on time for once. I didn't have a car and would normally call my mom to pick me up, but she was out of town and it was too late to call anyone else, so I decided to walk rather than waste money on a cab. I lived about 20 minutes away anyway, and felt pretty safe walking because you didn't really tend to run into other pedestrians at that hour. After a few minutes of walking, I noticed a car was driving really slowly behind me. The speed limit was 45, and this car was probably going about 10 miles per hour. I got a bad gut feeling and walked a little faster while trying to rationalize it. It could have been someone who wanted to offer me a ride or get directions, but no. Whoever it was stayed behind me and did not try to pull up next to me at all, even though they were going really slow. After about 5 minutes of this, the car finally turns off into one of the neighborhoods. I was relieved, but it was short-lived. The driver parks his car on the curb and gets out of his car, then comes jogging up to me. I realize immediately that it was Yogurt Bandit guy. He's wearing the same exact muddy brown jacket and is staring at me with those dark eyes. I turn around and start jogging down the sidewalk, which is still icy, and he just jogs up next to me. I can actually hear the change jingling in his pocket. He doesn't say anything at first, so I just try to run faster without slipping. Had this guy been sitting in the parking lot for hours, waiting for me to get off work? Apparently so. I feel him staring at me and turn my head to look at him while still running as fast as I can on the ice. Inwardly, I think my lucky stars that there was fresh gravel laid out, or I probably would have slipped in classic horror movie cliché. "What color is your underwear?" he asks. This question horrified and disgusted me, so my immediate reaction was, "Don't be a creep," and I punched him right in the face. It hurt my hand like a bitch, but he stops running for a second and bends forward a bit, clutching his face. I swear I heard him say, "Okay." But I just keep running and I'm too scared to look back. I'm not sure if he kept following me after that, but I didn't run straight home because I was scared of him figuring out where I lived. When I did make it home, probably an hour later, I went to my landlady's apartment first and told her what happened. I was really shaken up and I told her that if she saw a suspicious guy around the building, she should call police. My mom was out of town. I did still live with her at the time. And she didn't answer my call, so I watched Disney movies until I was calm enough to sleep. The next day I told the managers at work what happened, but they didn't care. In hindsight, I probably should have called the police, but I was young and I thought that if it was necessary, management would have told me to do it. Don't know why I thought that, considering they had a way of really not caring about their employees, and this sort of situation wouldn't have made them look good. This wasn't the only Walmart-related instance where police should have been called, but weren't. I felt pretty angry that they didn't take me seriously or care that I was scared. I wanted to go home early because I was scared that the guy would show up again, but they told me no and made me go back to work the registers. I quit shortly after that. I never did see Yogurt Bandit guy again, but it's been about 10 years and I'm not sure I'd even recognize him even if I did. Even so, Yogurt Bandit guy, let's not meet again.
Let me start off by saying that this story is 100% true. I don't know if that needs to be said or if me saying it makes it look like a work of fiction, but I'm not a regular here. I came here from Reddit No Sleep, and the rule there is that everything is true even if it's not, so it's pretty obvious that it's most likely fiction. This doesn't stop me from losing sleep, though. So, just in case this sub needs disclaimers as well, I figured I'd just put it in here. I'd also like to apologize in advance if the story gets long, but I'm kind of detail-oriented, and I also tend to ramble a bit when I talk. I have Asperger's syndrome, which, for those of you who don't know, is a high-functioning form of autism. And I'm writing it all as I go along, so again, sorry if this gets long or repetitive. Anyway, sorry for the obscenely long disclaimer. Let's begin. I was 16 or 17 when it happened. I can't remember for sure, even though I was only a couple years ago. But my mom and stepdad were outlandishly religious and incredibly strict about it. So unless we were dying, we had to go to church. I mean, seriously. My mother tried to keep us from going to our choir concerts and band concerts just because they happened to interfere with our church nights. The only reason she let us go to them is because they were a form of grade, and we would have failed the class if we missed any. Other than that, and crippling sickness, the only time I remember missing church was when I had a terrible sunburn. That got to that itchy healing phase, and no matter how much aloe or lotion I put on it, I couldn't stop constantly rubbing my arms because they itched so much. It was literally driving me insane, and I couldn't stop crying. Even then, she only let me stay home because she didn't want me to cause a scene. The way our church was set up, it was pretty open. To be a little dirty, I just can't explain it any better. It looked like an upside-down drawing of a terribly cartoonish penis. The door area was rounded with big glass doors on the right side, big windows on the left, and I can't recall whether the front was a big window or a small wall. Either way, it was very easy to see outside during the day, but incredibly difficult at night when the lights were on. When the sun went down, however, you could see everything going on inside without so much as a crane of your neck. Almost immediately inside was a hallway to the right, which had the bathrooms and the nursery, and at the front was a wall that was set with double doors on either side, which led into the sanctuary. We had a very small church family. It started out as only 2 people, then a few more came, and then a few more. When my family started going, we had about 20 members total, including the pastor and his family. We expanded a bit, but we never had less than 50 members when we moved to a new, bigger building. The new building was about the average size of a church, but it seemed enormous to us. Our old building was so small, and it could be taken apart and reconstructed perfectly inside the sanctuary, or the new building with no troubles. Now, I say all this because I think it may have been one of the reasons our congregation was so tiny. But because of the size of us and the slow rate that we grew at, everyone knew everyone. Even I knew everyone's names and birthdays, and I'm one of the most socially awkward people to ever grace this planet. You remember on the first Transformers movie when Megan Fox didn't know who Shia LaBeouf was, even though they'd been in the same school since kindergarten? Yeah, I'm the Shia LaBeouf. Except for me being a girl and all. But you know what I mean. No one ever knew who I was. This was my point. Anyway, the point of saying all that was to let you know that we were all close and we all knew each other. So when someone new came into our church, you can bet your bananas we all noticed. I think it was on a Sunday in January, when one of those guests came to us. My mother was the door greeter, so she was standing at the door when he came in. I was sitting on a couch facing away from the front area, rereading Inkheart for the upteenth time. I always loved that book so much, and my copy was so worn that the cover was no longer attached. I had to hold it separately when I was reading. Even though I reread the same part at least 7 times, trying to focus that night, I can't remember what part it was. When I heard a stranger's voice, concentrating on my favorite book became nearly impossible. Like filling a bathtub with the plug pulled out. I heard my mother's voice saying hello to someone and asked for their name, and then a male voice I didn't recognize muttered something that sounded like Nathan. My mom greeted the man warmingly and asked him how he found our church or something. You know, the typical visitor's greetings. He said something about driving to Texas while his wife and kids flew. I thought it was odd that the man would put his family on a plane and then drive himself, but I tried to ignore it. I didn't know his story and what he'd been through, or what was going on, so it wasn't my place to judge. Also, I just wanted to say that the judgmental talk is not because I'm religious. Because I'm really not. I always hated church and quit going as soon as I was able to. I just truly believe that we shouldn't be judgmental of everyone else. My mother gave him a pen and a guest form to fill out, and he took it with him to the bathroom. After a few minutes he came out, and being the socially awkward, autism-afflicted teen that I was, I did everything in my power to avoid looking at him until the last second. I caught a small glance as he went into the sanctuary, but all I saw was that he was wearing jeans and an ill-fitting black, silky button-down shirt with short sleeves before he rounded the corner and disappeared from view. I noticed that one of his arms didn't appear to work right, as he kept it held stiffly to his side. I didn't even catch his hair color. I think it was blonde or brown, but that's the most detail I can muster. I can remember exactly what I was wearing, however. A gray cheetah print top with a bright red scarf. I remember it so clearly, even though I gave the shirt away after that night and never asked my mom to borrow her scarf again. I don't wear red scarves anymore. After a few minutes, the 5-minute countdown started for service to begin. I marked my place and closed my book, putting it in my purse before I walked into the sanctuary. I went through the doors to find my seat and noticed that the man was sitting almost at the very back. He was surrounded by people trying to introduce themselves and asking how he'd find the place. He said something about coming off the highway as I passed by. I heard a woman exclaim that it was really out of the way and how awesome it was that God led him all the way here. And she wasn't lying. Our church was really out of the way. There was some specific twists and turns that you had to make in order to get here. That was all I heard before I was too far away, and I took my seat between my sisters on the very front row, where the entire youth group had to sit. A few minutes passed before the service started, and the pastor took his place on the platform in the chair next to my uncle. It was my mom's brother, who was, I can't remember his official title, but he was basically the pastor's right-hand man. The singers started up with one of their songs. Usually, I felt a pang of longing every time they got to go up there. I didn't like church very much, but I wanted so badly to be up there on that platform singing with them. But I felt none of that on this night. Instead, something felt off. My heart kept pounding, and I could feel the back of my neck prickling against my scarf. I'd never had that eerie feeling of being watched before then, so I wasn't sure what was going on. But I now know that feeling very well, and I wish I could have placed it back then. As much as I wanted to turn around and see what was making me so uneasy, I kept my eyes on the pastor, afraid to get in trouble turning around, which the teens at our church got in trouble for a lot. After about an hour and a half, the sermon finally ended, and the pastor invited everyone up to the altar to pray. I sighed and stood up quickly. I'd been having the urge to empty my bladder since the song service ended, but I didn't want to stand up and walk out while he was speaking, especially since I was so easy to spot. So I waited until the majority at church was standing, or at least singing, so I could make it out without anyone noticing me. This was the big mistake. I went into the restroom to see that there were a few other women in there, so I locked myself into the middle stall to do my business. Before I finished, everyone except the other one girl had all left. I heard the door open, and then a man's voice said, "Oops, sorry, wrong restroom," or something along those lines, and then the door closed again. I didn't recognize the voice, but because of what I was able to place, I thought it was the visitor. I didn't know why for some reason, but I found it extremely odd that he walked into the wrong restroom. There were signs on both the doors depicting which gender the bathroom was for. They were a bit faded, sure, but they were the signs that looked like stick figures wearing either pants or a dress. I thought they were easy enough to tell apart, but I figured maybe they were faded to a point that it was just so hard to tell now. I still couldn't shake the feeling, though, and I heard the other woman making some sort of flustered noise, and then the water turned on. She must have been fixing her clothes or her hair in the mirror when the man opened the door. I heard my uncle's voice outside the door asking what was wrong, and then the stranger's voice came in again, saying that something about a stomach ache. My uncle replied with that wasn't good, sounding generally concerned. He told him that he hoped he felt better and God bless. And then I heard his footsteps walking away. A minute later, the woman finished whatever she was doing and walked out, and I was alone. I finally finished up, but I couldn't shake that eerie feeling. I exited the stall and washed my hands, but as I put my hand on the door handle to pull it open, my senses started shrieking at me to stay in there. I froze for a second, trying to calm down, but over the pounding of my heart in my ears, I heard a rustle outside. I stepped back, thinking some woman was coming in and not wanting to be in her way, but all I heard was that strange sound, like silk rubbing against skin. My heart sped up as the noise continued, so I moved further away. I tried to calm myself down, knowing that I was being irrational, but the strange panic was pushing my heart into my throat. Without really knowing why, I walked even further away from the door and stepped sideways into the stall furthest away from it. I shut the door and quietly locked it without a sound. Then, because I was still feeling so irrationally afraid, I untied the red scarf that was around my neck and threw it over the partition into the next stall next to me, the one I had been previously in. As I stood in the stall trying to calm myself, breathing heavily for what seemed like an hour, I heard the bathroom door creak open. My fear took a hold of me, and I wedged myself between the toilet and the wall before I even realized what I was doing. Trying hard not to make a sound, my heels made a tiny click against the floor, and I cursed myself. Slipping my feet out from them and standing on my tiptoes behind them, my heartbeat came back into my ears, pounding like a hammer against my flesh like it was trying to burst out through my head. I had positioned myself so that even if someone looked underneath the walls of the stall, they wouldn't be able to see me unless they were right in front of my door. It was completely silent for a few moments, and then I heard the heavy footsteps on the tile. My heartbeat stopped completely, and there was no click of the heels, no soft double pat of the flat, just a solid footstep. No woman in our entire church walked like that. Out of nowhere, my uncle's voice boomed out. "Hey, what are you doing?" The door banged shut and I heard the stranger's voice stutter out an apology. "Sorry, man. I didn't realize this was the wrong bathroom." "I think you need to leave," my uncle practically growled. Now let me tell you something about my uncle. He's not a mean person. In fact, he has the biggest, softest heart of anyone I know. He's my favorite uncle for a reason. But while not being muscular, he was a big man, at least to me, and I stand around 5'8". He's at least a foot taller than me, and 3 times as wide, and I'm also not a skinny girl. He wasn't buying this stranger's bullshit at all at this point, and both voices came again, muffled so I couldn't hear what they were saying. I heard 2 sets of footsteps, one more solid than the other, and then the front door quickly opened and slowly swung shut. I stood frozen in my spot, trying to remember how to exhale without screaming. A few tears leaked out of my eyes as I realized that the strange man had been the one opening the bathroom door and trying to come in. A set of high-heeled steps came from outside, and my uncle's big voice came again. "Monica, go see if there's anyone in there." Monica was his daughter and one of my cousins. The door opened yet again, and I heard Monica's heels clicking against the tile. By now, my leaking tears had turned into soft sobs of terror, and I just tried to keep my body from freaking out. I was slowly coming to the realization of what just happened. "Hello?" I heard Monica's voice ringing into the bathroom, sounding almost authoritative. "Is anyone in here?" I unlocked my door, hoping that my mind wasn't just playing tricks on me, and I slowly opened it up. I peeked my head out and saw that it was really Monica, and she gasped at how tear-struck my face was. "Ashlyn? Is that man gone?" I tried to ask her, but it came out quiet and squeaky, and shaky. Somehow Monica understood the gravity of the situation despite not knowing what was going on, or what had happened, as she didn't come by until the guy had already gone. She put her arm around my shoulders and gently led me out of the restroom. I saw her eyeing my feet, and I knew she had noticed that my shoes were missing, but she didn't say a word about it. My uncle was standing in the hallway, and when his eyes fell on me, they were so sad and angry and shocked. "Are you okay?" he asked me. "Is that man gone?" I repeated to him, trying to make myself more understandable. It barely sounded any different, but somehow he got the message. "He's gone," he assured me, glaring at the front door. He walked him out and watched him drive off. As he told me, he paused and then said quietly, "His license plates were from Louisiana." I won't tell you what state I was in at the time, but it was definitely not Arkansas. My uncle noticed me shaking and took off his suit jacket, wrapping it around my shoulders like a blanket. "Here you go, back inside and sit next to your mom," he instructed me. And I did as he asked, not even asking why he was staying up front. Monica stood guard over me as she walked me inside and up to the front, where my mother was sitting with my two sisters. I told my family the general story of what had happened, but they laughed it off, saying that the creep probably wanted a peep. A few minutes later, however, my uncle came back inside to talk to the pastor, and the laughter ceased. Our pastor stood in front of everyone, looking incredibly somber. He proceeded to tell the congregation about his side of what happened to one of our young girls. As he put it, what he told us chilled me to the bone. Apparently, the guy had been watching me ever since the service had started, occasionally fiddling with something in his pocket. His eyes had not left the back of my head one single time. When the altar call started and I went into the restroom, he'd watched me leave, looked around as if making sure nobody was watching him, and then stood up and followed me out. The pastor told my uncle that the man had followed one of our youth outside towards the bathrooms and instructed him to go see what the man was doing. So my uncle went to go talk to the stranger, which must have been when the stomachache talk took place. My uncle came back in to report to our pastor after hearing about it. My pastor looked through the small window of the door to see the man had not gone into the man's restroom, but was instead walking around outside. He told my uncle to stand by the doors and immediately go back out if he saw a signal. Sure enough, towards the end of the altar call, he saw the guy take off down the hall towards the ladies' room and started pointing frantically. My uncle shot through the doors to find the man standing in the doorway, holding the door open and looking into the bathroom with a perplexed expression on his face as he drew something slowly out of his pocket. He had just barely begun to walk in when my uncle shouted at him. He dropped what he'd been holding and spun around, but not before my uncle caught a glimpse of the black handle of a rather large, folded pocket knife. After he told his tale and reminded everyone that there was evil out there, my mother and sisters started apologizing to me. The rest of the church realized that my uncle was missing his jacket, and after seeing me wearing a men's suit jacket that was much too big for me, they put two and two together, despite the pastor's attempt to keep me anonymous. We were formally dismissed, and instead of hanging out and chatting for an hour or two like usual, my mother quickly ushered me and my sisters out to the car. We passed by the bathrooms, and I looked down the hall, seeing the girls' bathroom right at the end, and it suddenly hit me so hard that my legs went weak for a second. I realized why I had found it so odd that the man would go into the wrong restroom. I remembered that the first thing he had done when he got there was use the men's restroom. I'm now 19 years old and living in an apartment with my boyfriend and his cousin's family. I don't know why that man decided to target me out of all the other girls. I wasn't the prettiest, not by a long shot. None of us were allowed to wear makeup or jewelry, even short skirts, so I couldn't have looked very attractive. The only skinny girl there was my 15-year-old sister. Maybe he just liked blondes, I guess, as everyone else there was a brunette. Or maybe it was my loud red scarf that caught his attention. Or maybe even a stalker or something. Either way, there was no doubt in my mind about what he wanted that night. I feel almost certain, for the way everything was set up, he was just planning to kidnap and rape me, possibly kill me. So all that being said, please, Mr. Silk Shirt, let's not ever officially meet.
I was teaching English in a Southeast Asian country a few years ago. I'm an Australian girl and was in my early 20s at the time. It was a pretty lonely time. The classes I taught were night classes for young adults, and my fellow teachers were quite cliquey, and I had yet to break into their inner circle. I had made friends, but not many close ones. It's worth noting that I had a mobile phone, but no SIM card. My only means of communication were to latch onto Wi-Fi at bars, cafes, work and my apartment. Anyway, the following happened on my day off, when I was alone. I had caught the bus into town. I lived in a shared apartment about 40 minutes from the city centre. To suss out the local museums and maybe see a movie. After 2 museums, multiple stops at air-conditioned bars for countless units of cigarettes and beer, I decided the afternoon was getting on. I was stinking hot and tired, so maybe I should head home. The sun was still out, but setting. It was about 4 p.m. and still quite light. I wasn't too familiar with the layout of the city and the bus route at this stage, but using my elementary navigational skills, I worked out a vague direction that I needed to walk to get to my bus stop. I was enjoying my slightly buzzed walk, following small back lanes closer and closer to this bus stop I had been on the hunt for. I was keen to get home, so I wasn't really paying attention to anything except following the setting sun, so I would be heading west. I remember walking past a small shop front, with a man sitting out the front. The man was thin, 30s, and somehow crooked looking. It looked like his shoulders and hips were completely out of alignment or something. He wore this ratchety old hat. Not a traditional hat, like a baseball cap. And an equally ratchety face. Anyway, there was a child, maybe 6 or 7, sitting next to him. At the time, I thought it was sweet, father and son boutique type thing. I gave them both a small awkward smile as I walked past. I barely lifted my head. The little boy looked at me strangely. Suddenly, the man's eyes lit up like crazy. I remember seeing him in my peripheral vision spring up from the gutter. He was crouching there, with great enthusiasm. He didn't say a word or make a sound, he just stood up very quickly as I finished walking by. I think he took my small awkward smile directed at the little boy as some kind of eerie invitation. I started feeling scared. I'm actually, admittedly, not very street savvy, so I guarantee my anxious mannerisms were obvious. I quickened my pace, pulled my bag closer to my stomach, and put my head down. I pretended to slow down to fix my sandal, but I was really trying to throw a quick look behind me to see what was going on. The man had quickened his pace in the last 10 or so meters of following me. He was closing in. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't trying to get my attention. He was just following me in a completely empty back street, still smiling enthusiastically. At this point, I was walking on the right-hand side of the road, my head swimming with paranoid thoughts. I tried to calm down and test out what was going on. I simply crossed the road to see if he would follow. I didn't check for motorbikes. This is Southeast Asia, remember, cars are few and far between. It dawned on me that a motorbike going by would actually be quite a good thing, even if it did hit me. What did hit me suddenly was the thought that we were very, very alone in this street. Sure enough, as I crossed, he quickly followed my path onto the other side of the street. My heart sank into my stomach. I had no idea how much longer this alley went on for. No windows looked out over it. Nobody was walking by. I didn't even really know what part of the city we were in. I couldn't speak the language very well. I hadn't told anybody where I was going. I remember sending my boyfriend a message that morning saying I was uncontactable for the day. We had fought the night before. Long distance sucks. Everything suddenly felt really wrong. Inherently wrong. I panicked more and pulled out my phone to pretend to make a phone call. I thought this might stop him. I was moving at a very fast walk, nearly a jog at that point. He was picking up his pace gradually, and the gap between us was now less than a few meters. To grab my phone, I had to rummage around through all the mess in my handbag, which had slowed me down. I felt his presence closer behind me. I thought, fuck the fucking phone, and broke into a sprint. He started sprinting too. I remember making a noise, not quite a scream, more of a whelp. I shouted, "Stop now!" in English. Then "No!" and "Go, leave," in the native tongue of the country I was in. I didn't turn around. My bag was smacking my thigh, my feet were pounding the concrete, my heart was racing. He was still behind me. I decided to make a bold move, which I'm glad I did. I saw another alleyway opening up to my left. It looked larger. I could see windows facing onto it. Here we go, I thought. I just need other people to be around, and this will be fine. I turned down the alleyway, still shouting, "No!" in this language. I couldn't see any faces in the windows. There were bikes out the front of people's houses, so it was likely there were people around. I kept sprinting. Then I got super fucking lucky. After a few bends in the alley, I saw this huge intersection on the other side. I'm talking 8 or so lanes of traffic, all over each other. This man was still pursuing me. I refused to look him in the eye, but he was fearless. He could hear me shout, and it hadn't stopped him. I finally thought, "Ha, fuck you, buddy," when I saw the intersection. It was finally over. Thank fuck. I exited the alley and saw the sweet comfort of buzzing motorcycles and other people's faces in front of me. I had no idea where I was in relation to this bus stop. I immediately decided I was avoiding public transport today, so I looked for a taxi. I knew there were some legitimate private taxi companies, and some dodgy ones by this stage. I waited until I saw a trusted brand parked on the other side of the intersection. I was fine. This was fine. The man had stopped when he'd seen me move into the business of the road. I glanced over my shoulder, and the motherfucker stood there, waving at me from the exit point of the alley and the intersection. Just waving fucking casually. I recoiled in disgust, crossed my arms over my chest, something I do to relieve a bit of anxiety, and kept walking at a steady pace towards the cab. I hop in the cab and make my best attempt at speaking the local language, telling the driver my address and basic directions on how to get there. The driver had trouble understanding me. Can you blame him? The Australian accent is bloody terrible. So I pulled out my notebook and wrote the address down for him. Unfortunately, my writing was quite difficult for him to read too, so I slowed down and tried to explain it more clearly. I wasn't really paying attention to anything going on except helping the driver understand where I wanted to go. I heard the back door of the cab slam. The driver and I swung around. There he fucking was. He had gotten into the cab with me. I was in shock. I spluttered. The nerve on this guy. He started barking instructions at the driver, who was clearly confused. My basic understanding of what he said was, "I'm going with her, she's my girlfriend, take us away from the city." I'm guessing my stalker had assumed I didn't understand any of his language, but I did, and that message worried me. I was alone in a car with two strange men in a foreign country, and one had the explicit intent of kidnapping me. What kind of ridiculous position is that to be in? So I did what any insane, terrified person would do. I screamed. Illegibly, in no language that made any sense. I did everything I could to convey to this driver that I was unsafe. I made strange, wailing noises and basically said "no" over and over again. The driver looked at both of us, confused out of his fucking mind, waiting for the prank cameras, I'm guessing. After about a minute of me screaming at the driver and my stalker, who had begun to touch my hair from the back seat, despite me swatting him away multiple times, the driver got the shits, and said something very threatening in their language. The driver turned the keys, walked around to the stalker in the back seat, and verbally abused him, waving his keys in his face. The stalker man put on this "what can you do, eh" face, smug-ass little dickworm. He finally got out of the car and tried to tug on my hair as he got out. The driver took me to my apartment, where in his language I brokenly tried to explain what had happened. Turned out this lovely gentleman did speak a little English, so I tried to give him the full story as best I could. He dropped me home 40 minutes later, tried to refuse a fee, but I stuck 3 times the actual fare in the driver's door as I got out. I'll never be able to thank him properly for picking up on the universal language of distress and handling it with such kindness. Still, creepy man who abandoned his kid to chase me senselessly through a city, let's not meet again. Moral of the story, don't give off awkward, scared vibes. It's an invitation that says, I'm probably incapable of defending myself if need be. Also, there's a reason I didn't include this specific country. I actually loved every country in Southeast Asia so goddamn much, and this story was pretty much the only negative thing that happened to me. The people there, overall, are kind and warm, and I won't taint the country's reputation because of one weirdo.